It is a military actor that does advance the business interests of the Kremlin.
We can just make a guess that Putin is getting his own little cut from every contract that Prigozhin signs.
The Wagner Group, a shadowy private military company led by Yevgeny Prigozhin that has been making headlines for its involvement in the war in Ukraine. The paramilitary group has become indispensable to the Kremlin's military operations, equipped with an operational competence in sharp contrast to the Russian military, who is facing challenges in maintaining command of its own forces.
This is not truly a private company, given the fact that it has the support of the Russian government.
In early May, Prigozhin announced that his forces would be pulling out of the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. And his recent claim of victory in the city before the exit is being questioned by experts. This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, we're revisiting an archived episode from earlier last year that has taken on renewed significance in light of recent developments in the war in Ukraine. How has Russian foreign policy contributed to the rise of organizations such as the Wagner Group? What purpose do they serve that cannot be accomplished by a national army? And what challenges do they raise in the areas that they operate? In this episode, we were joined by Jack Margolin and Kimberly Martin. Jack Margolin is a program director at C4ADS, where he leads the Conflict Finance and Irregular Threats team investigating illicit networks. His work focuses on understanding the financial drivers of conflict, including war economies, arms trade, and networks involved in war crimes, utilizing emerging technology and partnerships to enhance human security and accountability. Professor Kimberly Martin is a highly regarded expert in international relations, focusing on Russia, international security, and environmental politics. She has conducted extensive research on topics such as Russia's Arctic extractive enterprises, the Wagner Group's activities, and Russia's relationship with NATO, contributing to scholarly publications, testifying before Congress, and engaging with media outlets to share her insights. Moderating the discussion is Joanna Gwevcheski, who received her PhD from Oxford, has been a policy advisor to a number of congressional candidates, and is a senior program advisor for Network 2020.
So first, I would like to turn to you, Kim. Could you please provide some background on who is the Wagner Group, when it came into existence, and how it has evolved? And also, what purpose does it serve for Russian foreign policy?
Sure. Thanks, Joanna, and thanks, Courtney, for inviting me. That you've listed a very large group of questions, so let me start at the beginning. The Wagner Group in its current form emerged in 2014 in eastern Ukraine, in Crimea. It has evolved a lot since then. It is not the same organization in various places in the world that it is involved. And so rather than thinking of it as a group or as an organization, we should think of it as a contracting mechanism for use by the Russian Military Intelligence Agency, the GRU. In 2016, we first understood that Yevgeny Prigozhin was involved as the contractor. It's not clear that he's been involved in their activities in Ukraine, but he certainly has in Syria and throughout Africa. And along with his contracting of the personnel, he has engaged in various kinds of oil and mineral contracting in various places where it's been deployed to guard various locations where Russia has engaged as a contractor for providing security for those facilities. Let me see if I can remember your other questions that all came at once. The major purpose it serves, I think, is to avoid casualty casualties for regular Russian military forces. It may have started out as having a plausible deniability role for the international audience, but I think now it's followed by investigative journalists and by UN officials and other government officials so closely wherever it goes that the plausible deniability is really for the at-home audience. And it is to avoid casualties in either actions like Ukraine, where there is a lot of death happening, but in Syria and in Africa, also to allow Russia to be experimental in terms of what it does in its security policy without putting Russian conscripts at risk. Russia still has a military draft.
Okay, thank you. And then I wanted to just drill down further with you, Jack, about what type of military involvement does the Wagner Group have in various countries, and does it differ from place to place? And there is one aspect, such as the assistance in Mali, for example, that is welcomed, obviously, by the government, while we see in Ukraine that they're seeing it as their presence is seen as a violation of sovereignty. So can you talk a little bit about the militarily what the Wagner Group does in these various countries?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Joanna. And I'll say that our organization's work at C4ADS, we're really focused on sort of investigating the networks and using publicly available information to document activity. So we are deeply indebted to the work that Dr. Martin has done, mapping out the sort of history of these networks, and what Polina has done to contextualize and really dig deeper on what Wagner's involvement means in countries like the Central African Republic, which I think help us get away from a tendency that we see in some places to sort of paint these activities with a broad brush. So it's important to keep in mind their history, the network, and also the interactions that these networks have with their partners on the ground. Yeah, absolutely. The sort of package of services that Wagner offers and what their military activity looks like in different countries varies case by case. Important to understanding why that is the case and the different types of packages that we see in different places, I think, is really to keep in mind what Kim pointed out earlier, which is that Wagner effectively is a contracting mechanism. Prigozhin provides a corporate infrastructure that supports finance and logistics for operations that can be used for direct combat support, training, a variety of other purposes that are principally being administered by Russian military intelligence. So within the sort of spectrum of services that Wagner provides on the military side, we see everything from training, so working alongside local forces in Central African Republic is everything from the gendarmerie to the FACA, the actual armed forces of the country itself, to engaging in combat directly. And that can be either partnered with local military as well as non-state armed groups, local militias, and even local private military companies. Principally in Syria, we saw a lot of this activity with private military companies which are principally set up for the reason of doing business with Russian PMCs, but which nonetheless were an important part of their ability to collaborate with local forces and places like Deir ez-Zor. Recently, some of those companies on the Syrian side were actually designated by the European Union. So there is this sort of spectrum of either more sort of rear echelon side, helping out these forces and upskilling them, as well as deploying directly with them, either state or non-state forces. In Ukraine, this is obviously a bit different, and part of that is because part of the advantage that Wagner offers with this semi-privatized structure that's pulled largely from Prigozhin's extended corporate network doesn't really offer a lot of the same advantages, or it offers them in a different way. So in Africa and Syria, those networks can offer the ability for Wagner to effectively integrate with local commercial and political constituencies by creating companies that not only generate revenue, but also let them engage with communities in politics there and in business there. It can give them additional leverage, additional contacts, et cetera. In Ukraine, that is not an advantage that Wagner really has to bring to bear. And I think it's also important to consider that the sort of larger scope of the lineage of Russian PMCs is also very present in Ukraine. So it's very instructive to look at Kim's earlier paper regarding sort of everything from Slavonic Corps and RSB Group, et cetera, to understand some of the actors that are now involved in Ukraine. It's not just what we would term Wagner. It's a variety of other structures that are used largely for recruiting, essentially from across Russia in order to staff Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They're still using a lot of Wagner infrastructure. Meduza, a Russian language investigative outlet, has published some really great reporting on this recently that sort of documents the timeline of Wagner Prigozhin network involvement in the invasion of Ukraine. But they're principally being used in order to recruit for this effort, alongside everything from contracting to regular Ministry of Defense, recruitment through what they refer to as volunteer battalions. But all of that effectively is to have more young men to send to the front, and to do it deniably. And many of these cases, we're seeing that there are reporting, particularly from Russian investigative media, that these sort of PMC recruits are forming some of the more essential assault forces that are being used at the front lines in some of the areas that are most likely for them to incur losses. And quite a bit of reporting about recruitment from places like prisons indicates that the expectations for losses for these Russian PMCs is quite high. So in these cases, I think we can see that it offers a pretty different advantage. It's a very different sort of MO that's being employed by the same or similar infrastructure. But all of it serves to benefit the Russian government and the Russian military by providing them advantages that they can't get through more conventional deployments.
Thank you so much. How does the Wagner Group financially benefit from its host countries? Is it through arms sales? Is it resource access? If you could just talk a little bit about how they economically, how they draw benefits from their presence in these host countries.
Yeah, absolutely. This really varies quite a bit from country to country, by virtue of the fact that Wagner can be flexible. The other thing worth keeping in mind is that this is not truly a private company. It is not subject to the same sort of market imperatives that a more conventional private military and security company might be, given the fact that it has the support of the Russian government. So that gives Wagner this ability to extend itself for engagements that might be, at least at first, unprofitable. So to give an idea of the kind of spectrum of different ways that Wagner generates revenue and the purposes for that, this network was really, really successful in doing this in Syria. And part of that was because of these really strong, long-standing business ties between Russian businessmen and Syrian businessmen and the Syrian government. And because of that, Prigozhin was able to basically use this, and the fact that he held this portfolio for supporting this broader PMC network, to effectively appoint himself one of the leading Russian businessmen in engagement with the Syrian commercial sector. So if you look at very important sort of Russian business leaders in Syria right now, Prigozhin and Gennady Timchenko and his sort of Stroytrans gas networks, their infrastructure is extremely important to that relationship. Now, because of that, also because there was a large demand for Russia to secure particularly extraction sites, extinguish wildfires, et cetera, the Russian government and Prigozhin were able to extract some pretty outrageous concessions and terms for effectively their contract for liberating oil fields and subsequently supporting the resumption of extraction of oil and natural gas. In that case, it was fairly, I guess you could say it was fairly standard, as like there's a contract here for you will get you will liberate these oil fields. We will begin extraction again. Where it becomes unusual is they were basically being compensated through the revenue from the extracted natural resources, and Prigozhin's corporate infrastructure, namely this company called Yevropolis LLC, which is designated by the US Treasury, was entitled to a certain percentage of oil revenues. And if those oil revenues were not available, there was basically a flat fee that they would extract. In places like Sudan and the Central African Republic, those networks had to be a little bit more flexible because there wasn't the same sort of infrastructure opportunity set up for immediate financial success. In Sudan, in the early days, we really see that the sort of Prigozhin and Wagner related corporate infrastructure involved principally in gold mining struggled to get up on its feet. They lacked real awareness of the local market. They lacked awareness of the local actors. Early efforts that they made to create a successful mining enterprise were sort of bumbling. They poached some talent from existing Russian mining companies in the region. It's also worth emphasizing that Wagner is not the only player in this game. There are other Russia-based consortiums or Russia-based companies that are engaged in natural resources business across Africa. And through that, they were able to basically upskill themselves. And over time, they've developed a much more successful enterprise that's been documented recently in a much more sort of mature phase. Similarly, in the Central African Republic, which Paulina can describe, I think, in much greater detail than I can, being much more aware of the local dynamics, similarly, they were able to, through their local connections, through relationships that they built in country, establish corporate infrastructure or business that's much more likely to be profitable. I think it's too early to say for certain what this looks like in the Mali context, but I will note that there are some kind of unusual exceptions to this rule. While there are opportunities for business related to natural resource extraction in places like Libya and in Mozambique, those weren't necessarily a chief aim of the business, at least not in documentation that we see from publicly available information or in investigative media reporting. So in places like Libya, there are perhaps angles to the business that involve securing specific key sites related to oil and natural gas, or other mineral resource extractive activities, hydrocarbons, et cetera. But that doesn't seem to be their primary emphasis. That comes along with other sorts of idiosyncrasies of these particular deployments, particularly in Libya, where we see Wagner combatants doing things like flying missions aboard MiG and Sukhoi fighter aircraft, which is extremely unusual to consider a private company doing, particularly when based in Russia. And I think is another piece of very important evidence in understanding their relationship with the Ministry of Defense and particularly military intelligence. So there is this sort of, I would say, broad spectrum of commercial activity that Wagner engages in. The other thing I would emphasize is something I alluded to earlier, which is that the principal aim of these business activities is revenue generation. That is important. There needs to be some kind of compensation, particularly for Prigozhin and taking on this portfolio. I term this broadly a portfolio, providing the corporate, the financial, the logistical infrastructure to support this activity deniably abroad. But there's also a set of sort of strategic aims that are satisfied by this, by appearing in country alongside Russia-based mining or hydrocarbons enterprise, or even timber enterprises we've seen recently, as Paulina has alluded to in Central African Republic. They're able to integrate more effectively with the local political economy and the actors that are important in that local political economy. In the Sudan case, we can see this kind of explicitly represented through the relationship between the Wagner Group and the Rapid Support Forces, which is a immensely influential paramilitary organization in Sudan. Wagner grew that relationship through its investments, not only into security assistance, but also mining prior to the 2019 revolution in Sudan. And by all accounts has sought to maintain that relationship through similarly military assistance and those commercial relationships. So this provides a sort of important venue for Wagner to engage politically and commercially with key actors in these countries and establish influence through means beyond simply providing security assistance that's not available from other internationals, and which comes with many less strings attached and conditions than we're used to seeing from other internationals engaging in these countries. So it's a complicated answer to a complicated question.
Great. No, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated. Kim, following up on something Jack said about this idea of how the Russian government's, the fine line between the Russian government and the Wagner Group, how that is displayed, and how closely is Wagner linked to the Kremlin and the Russian army, and what is Putin's relationship to that group?
Sure. So before I get to that question, I just want to follow up on something that Jack just said that answers Nikita Kozhemyakin's question in the Q&A about our source material. Jack's group, C4ADS, does a wonderful job of finding all kinds of economic, contractual, and big data information to use in this. In addition to that, there's been a couple of terrific reporters inside Russia, investigative reporters. One is Denis Karatkov and one is Lilia Yaporova. It has become more difficult to get information because of the way that Putin has cracked down on independent reporting in the last couple of years, but their reporting, especially early on, was crucial in terms of both defining Prigozhin's role. There's photographic evidence of Prigozhin's role and of people who worked with Prigozhin, and also of exactly which countries they've been in and what they've been doing. There are also United Nations reports that have come out from both the Central African Republic and Libya about what the Wagner Group is doing. Russia tried to quash those reports and failed. They leaked out and then were eventually publicly published. There was also a laptop found in Libya from a Wagner Group person who was defeated and ran away and left the laptop behind. And so we have just lots of various ways of finding the information. It's not coming from one source and it's not politicized. But then on to your question, we have an immense amount of information linking the Russian Military Intelligence Agency, the GRU, to the Wagner Group. We know that their passports are on the same linked number of international passport travel coming out of the Russian travel agency. We know that their training base, their primary training base, has been located next to the primary training base for GRU special forces in Russia. We know that somebody who is a retired GRU officer founded the Wagner Group, and somebody else who is a retired GRU officer is the person in the Central African Republic working with President Touadéra and also working with the Wagner Group people there. So just in all kinds of ways, we know they're directly connected to the GRU. In terms of links to Putin himself, Prigozhin has longstanding links to Putin from the time that Putin was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Prigozhin got out of prison early. He was in prison for 9 years for organized criminal activities, primarily being involved in a gang that was robbing people on the street, including taking winter clothes and boots from people in the middle of the winter in St. Petersburg, which is, frigid cold in the winter, just gives you a sense of what kind of person he is. He got out of prison early. We don't know exactly why, but at that time in history, it was probably done through a deal with the KGB, that he turned sides in return for getting out of prison early. He managed to set up a series of successful businesses in St. Petersburg, started as a grocery business, then opened up a chain of restaurants during the time that Putin was the person responsible in St. Petersburg for signing off on all new contracts at a time when privatization was happening. When Putin went to the Kremlin in Moscow, Prigozhin followed close behind, became a contractor for the Russian military, became a contractor for the Russian public school system, and became a contractor for catering that happened in the Kremlin. And when even George W. Bush visited Russia, Putin took him to St. Petersburg to eat at Prigozhin's restaurant. And Prigozhin has been a guest, for example, when the Libyan warlord Khalifa Haftar came to the Kremlin to talk to Russian military people about what Russia's role would be in Libya. Prigozhin was photographed being there and speaking with him. So the relationship between him and the Russian government is very strong, and between him and Putin as individuals is very strong. And although we, as far as I know, we don't have any public source information about this, we can just make a guess based on what we know about everything else that happens in Russia, that Putin is getting his own little cut from every contract that Prigozhin signs.
My next question is for Jack. Can you speak about how the Wagner Group uses social media and disinformation to achieve its aims? I'm thinking of Russia blaming Western sanctions on grain shortages in Africa in order to raise opposition by African nations to the sanctions. So could you talk a little bit about what they do in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the one aspect of sort of larger Wagner Group activities, the sort of pantheon of services they provide and activities they engage in that we haven't really touched on here. We talked about military activity, the commercial activity, but we haven't really talked about the disinformation, misinformation operations that relate to Wagner. So important to understand that Prigozhin has a long history of being heavily involved in Russian state-backed disinformation efforts. He was designated not just for his role as an oligarch and the sort of patron behind the Wagner Group, but also because he was one of the principal funder of the Internet Research Agency, more commonly known as the Troll Farm. He also has sort of a larger media apparatus that he funds that similarly engages in the same type of espousing of pro-Russian narratives. It's what you'd expect narrative-wise. Where Wagner has been involved, one of the sort of key parts of the package that they offer local governments is not only coup-proofing through security assistance, but also conducting sociological research paired with efforts to reach out to local populations and shore up support, typically for an incumbent. We saw this in Sudan, where the corporate infrastructure that followed the Wagner Group and the Russian mining company engaged there, Mirawi Gold, into the country, was contracted directly to conduct that kind of research and conduct those same types of campaigns in Sudan. In the Central African Republic, this has perhaps been the most visible, both in terms of sort of physical propaganda, but also a lot of the coordinated inauthentic activity, coordinated inauthentic behavior that we see on social media. So these networks will pair that type of effectively astroturfed or artificial activity on social media alongside real world efforts to distribute propaganda, engage local communities, kind of at the most extreme or outrageous level. This includes production of propaganda films. A series of companies related to Prigozhin have been involved in the production of several movies that basically mythologize what Wagner is doing across Africa and in Ukraine. Most of that is fairly run-of-the-mill Russian propaganda. It doesn't really seem to have that large of a viewer base. There were some efforts made to make sure that local populations, particularly in Central African Republic, were able to view those propaganda movies, but it's not really clear where there's an effective audience for that specific type of propaganda. Where it is clear that there's a more effective audience and where there's more targeted efforts has really been around the use of both coordinated and authentic behavior on social media sites, as identified by Graphica, Stanford Internet Observatory, and social media companies themselves. Also, by working with local media in countries in which Wagner is active. So we see this particularly in Libya, that involved everything from funding the creation of entirely new television stations, working closely with local media partners in order to provide them with better resources to report more effectively on narratives that were going to suit the Wagner Group, to suit the Russian interest in Libya, and particularly in this case, suit the interests of their proxy, Khalifa Haftar. We also see engagement with local actors in order to actually conduct these types of activities themselves. I believe about 2 years ago, CNN and several others exposed that networks connected with the Internet Research Agency and the sort of larger Prigozhin-related corporate infrastructure were involved in supporting efforts across Africa to effectively create this kind of inauthentic material, conduct information operations on social media, contracting with companies and organizations in Africa in order to produce that material. On the sort of, I think, most sophisticated end of this spectrum, in terms of the largest amount of effort, these networks leverage what in Russia would be deemed a political technologist, effectively political consultants, in order to not only do research in country, but engage with local political actors, and not only engage within social media, but also basically try to pull together constituencies that are important, whether they're business constituencies or other political constituencies in the country, and drum up support for sort of their chosen candidates. And we saw efforts by this, particularly by the sort of cluster of election observing / political fidelity nonprofit organizations under the Afrique banner, all of which ties back through their corporate infrastructure to Prigozhin's networks, and were involved in places ranging from Mozambique to South Africa, really across the entire continent. All of that has the effort of really guiding politics across Africa. Now, to the degree to which that's actually effective, I think is an open question. The degree to which that is as effective or works without or works in tandem with their security assistance, I think is also an important question. Would this network have the same kind of impact on politics within the Central African Republic had they not been as instrumental as they were to creating stability and supporting effectively the campaign of the FACA, the counterinsurgency campaign, to push beyond Bangui? I don't know if it's possible to say that. I think we can hypothesize that security assistance component is pretty critical to the success of these propaganda efforts in country. The last thing I'll say there, we need to be really careful not to discount every piece of pro-Russian media, particularly within Africa, as being a piece of Russian propaganda or coordinated and authentic behavior. In Mali in particular, we've seen a lot of organic sentiment that is very pro-Russian, very anti-French. There are ample historical reasons for this. There has been a long-standing set of political trends that account for that. And there have been actors that have been espousing these viewpoints for a long time. Now, do they have engagement with Russian actors? Are they supported by them? It's possible. But I think it's still worth us considering. And I think it's critical to being able to engage with these countries constructively, that we consider that a lot of this sentiment is actually organic, and that Russia is rather seizing on opportunities with existing pro-Russian sentiment rather than fomenting it in places where there is none.
Great, thank you so much. And then Kim, is the Wagner Group unique in the world, would you say? Do other states or group of states utilize similarly structured organizations in pursuit of their foreign policy goals?
Sure. So thanks for the question. I'd say that it's unique among wealthy countries. It looks more like what we might expect a militia to look like in some place that has warlords on the ground, where they're trying to simultaneously control territory and get economic benefit using patronage networks, because it really is a patronage-based network. But Russia is unique in not having signed off on what's called the Montreal Accords. It's I don't remember the exact year, but it was an agreement that was made, a non-binding agreement that was made in the mid-2000s at some point for countries to agree upon how they would manage private military companies that worked with governments. It was done sort of in the aftermath of what was happening with Blackwater in the United States. And it also included China, which, you know, is sort of unexpected because China in many ways seems a little bit like Russia. But even China signed off on the Montreal Accords in terms of how states would control the private military companies working for them. And Russia is not a party to that accord. And of course, in Russia, the Wagner Group is still technically illegal, even though it's very clear that that Putin supports it. So that part of it is unique. Let me just also answer one question in the Q&A about Venezuela. In 2019, Reuters reported in an investigative report based on interviews on the ground that the Wagner Group was providing security for Nicolas Maduro when he was facing instability in Venezuela. Nobody has ever been able to confirm that. We do know that there were certainly Russian contractors, security contractors of various kinds on the ground, but some investigative reporters, including Lilia Yaporova, talked to people who said it wasn't Wagner. And what complicates things is that Candice Rondeau at New America has determined that some of the people who worked with Wagner over time have also been contractors for Rosneft security provision. And so a question was raised in Q&A, was Wagner in Venezuela in 2019? I don't think we know for sure. There were people who had worked for Wagner who were contractors on the ground. But as far as I know, nobody has ever found any interest for Prigozhin being in Venezuela. And Maduro didn't need Russia to come in to provide security support for him because his own forces and also the Cuban forces who were supporting him were very well trained in that.
Oh, okay, interesting. Actually, this is a follow-on question for you then, Kim, that's related. How is the Wagner Group significantly different than the Blackwater Group by the US in Iraq and US-funded Contras in Latin America? Are not similar mercenaries also fighting on Ukraine's side currently from the UK and the US?
Blackwater and what was happening in Central America are historical. And what set them apart historically from what Russia is doing now is that, as far as I know, there was never that private criminal component to it that was connected to the state and to private interests in the state. And so certainly Blackwater did some terrible things. There were certainly US military contractors in Latin America who did terrible things. They may have engaged in criminal activities, but if they engaged in criminal activities, they were not doing so on behalf of the US president as a private actor. And so that is a difference and a similarity. But as I said, the Montreal Accords really came in and set a set of guidelines that have been followed ever since. And the military contractors that work with the United States and with the United Kingdom and with other major countries have a very strong incentive to follow those guidelines because they want future business. Blackwater really got a black eye by the fact that it was in so many press reports for having committed murder and for engaging in all kinds of activities that was not something that the United States wanted to be associated with. And if you want to keep on being hired as a contractor, you don't want that on your record. And somebody who's done a lot of really good work on this is Deborah Avant. And so I would just give a shout out to her for the work that she did. She was actually somebody who helped explain the importance of the Montreal Accords and got people to agree to sign on. And there was another part of your question that, it was about Ukraine. As far as I know, the Ukrainian government is trying at least to hold up Western standards in terms of how its personnel act in the field. They do have a separate unit of people who are coming from foreign countries who are supporting them. In the case of warfare, it is always the case that there's not perfect central control over things. I think we did have a case of there being people who were associated with the Ukrainian military who did commit at least some acts of murder in terms of people who were captured Russian forces that should have been treated as captured forces under the Geneva Conventions. But as far as I know, there is not evidence that people who are associated with the US or the UK or other Western countries who are on the ground in Ukraine are acting with the knowledge and support of the Ukrainian government to carry out atrocities. And that's a distinction from the Wagner Group, which carries out atrocities everywhere it goes, just as the Russian military carries out atrocities by intentionally bombing civilians everywhere it goes. It's doing it now in Ukraine. It did it in Syria. It did it earlier in Chechnya. It's just a modus operandi for the Russians.
Yes, thank you, Kim, for pointing out that really important difference. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. There's a lot more questions that we couldn't get to, but I wanted to thank the panelists so much for a fascinating and illuminating conversation about the different components of the Wagner Group and their various activities and what we might see in the future.
Thank you for listening to this archived episode. For more insight and analysis on global events and to learn more about how you can join our community, visit us at network2020.org and follow us on social media.